This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real knowledge and insight. This week, what can we do about Russia? After Russian ships and planes chased a Royal Navy destroyer in the Black Sea, are we already in a kind of conflict with Russia? One that's even more intense than periods of the Cold War? And could this one get hotter? I've been talking to Chris Bryant, former Europe Minister in the Labour government and now chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Russia. I began by asking him if this was the worst relations had been with Russia since Vladimir Putin took power.
First of all, do you think relations between Britain and Russia have been worse? Are these the worst they've been since Putin was in power?
Obviously hit a low when Alexander Litvinenko was murdered and by Russian agents in the UK, and they hit another low when there was the attempted murder of the Skripals in Salisbury, which led to Dawn Sturgis's death. So they've been bumping along on pretty low for quite some time, and understandably so, because Putin clearly has territorial ambitions beyond his own borders. He's broken virtually every international accord that he's signed, and you can't just have somebody, marauding all over the world and bumping people off.
Okay, what about let's talk specifically about that Black Sea incident recently. Do you think the British were doing the right thing? Do you think there was an element of I think I even heard one of the sailors on the Royal Navy ship talking about poking the Russian bear. Should we be doing that kind of thing?
I think it's a bit daft, if I'm honest. It all felt like a great big PR opportunity. I mean, by some miracle, there was a BBC camera crew and there on board HMS Defender. Oh, and by some other miracle, there was a journalist for the Daily Mail as well. I think this is all about PR for Downing Street. However, of course, I completely and utterly agree that Crimea has been illegally annexed. It is the territorial integrity of Ukraine was meant to be guaranteed by the Budapest Accord, which was signed by Britain under John Major and by Putin, with the express understanding that the territorial integrity of Ukraine would be guaranteed because they were going to surrender their nuclear weapons. So, yes, we are legally right. I think we are playing a bit of a PR game.
Do you think it would be wise to do that sort of thing again, to say, look, these are international waters, or we are not simply accepting the status quo as a result of Russian expansionism, if we could put it like that? Would it be wise to do that again, or do you think we should be backing off?
Well, it's a new version of gunboat diplomacy, isn't it, really? When you're basically just sailing a ship through some territorial waters. I think we are in the legal right. And indeed, for that matter, there are other places in the world where there are similar issues of whether British ships are allowed to go or not, including the South China Sea. And again, I think the British government position is absolutely right. But we need to do these things in collaboration with our allies. If the French were to do it in a month's time, and the Italians and the Danes and so on in future, and the United States of America, I'd be perfectly happy with that. These are not Russian territorial waters. But I think you have to do all of this as part of an international attempt to bring Putin to some kind of common understanding that you can't simply invade other countries.
We're going to talk a bit later about what's going on with Russia outside Russian borders, but I do want to ask you about what you make of the regime itself. I mean, is this a regime inside Russia that could be described as a democracy? Would you regard it as a democracy?
It's a very strange form of democracy when lots of people aren't allowed to stand because their political party isn't authorized by the regime. It's a very strange kind of democracy when there's only really one party elected to the Duma. It's a very strange kind of democracy when political activists are not allowed to campaign, they're not allowed to deliver leaflets, they're not allowed to meet, they're not allowed to have protests or demonstrations, and when leading activists, opposition activists, either have their newspapers closed down or are poisoned and then sent to prison.
You mentioned the Duma there, the Russian parliament. You're the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Russia. Do you have any exchanges, contacts with the Russian parliament?
None. And a few members of the House of Lords visited the Duma last year. I think that was a mistake. The Russians tried to present that as some kind of great diplomatic coup. It showed that lots of people in Britain wanted to normalise relations with the Russian Federation. And I would love to normalise relations with the Russian Federation, but it's difficult to do that in a set of circumstances where you have Russia deliberately engaging in misinformation campaigns in lots of democratic countries around the world, deliberately trying to destabilise democracies, taking advantage of the strong legal system and educational system we have in the UK so as to get their very wealthy people a place there, launder their money and educate their children, whilst engaging in acts of semi-warlike aggression against other, free states. That makes it very difficult to have normalised relations.
And presumably, as long as you have this system internally, that feeds an external problem for the rest of the world, because the nature of the regime is it is based on I guess a sort of image of strength, an image of assertion of Russia as a great power.
Well, it's interesting that every time there's a rising tide of discontent with Putin within Russia, there's suddenly some attempt by the regime to wage sort of acts of aggression on other countries. That's why the annexation of Crimea happened, because Putin was facing anger on the streets in Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod and other parts. My biggest sadness in all of this is that Russia is a great country with phenomenal cultural and economic history to rely on. The people of Russia, I think, are poorly served by a government that spends far too much on security and its armed forces, grossly out of proportion to what it needs, and on an economy which is increasingly what they call in Russia a monogorod. That is to say, like a city that only has one industry, and their only industry is petrocarbons. That makes them very vulnerable to the rising or falling cost of gas and oil, makes them very vulnerable for the future. And it simply makes it difficult for that economy and for the Russian people to prosper.
Is it an economy at the moment where outsiders, even if they wanted to invest to, say, develop other parts of the economy, can do so?
Well, the difficulty that has been expressed to me by lots of British businesses is there is such a level of corruption in the Russian state that most international corporations find it really difficult to do secure business in Russia without bribing somebody, and you just can't hide that on the books, and so it makes it much more difficult. If you're a drinks firm, how do you get your whiskey or your vodka or your wine or whatever in bars in St. Petersburg? Really difficult without bribing a whole series of local officials, and that makes it difficult.
I mean, the business links between the UK and Russia are extensive. At least, certainly, there's been an awful lot of Russian money coming into the UK and London over the last few years. I mean, Does Britain have a kind of unique relationship with Russia in some ways? I mean, we've obviously seen that they're not above actually targeting people on UK soil, but there's an awful lot of Russian interest and influence inside the UK, isn't there?
I think it is a terrible problem for us in the UK that we are very open to dirty Russian money. The Foreign Affairs Select Committee produced a report on this a couple of years ago, and I think was very insightful. If you want to launder £20 million, the easiest way to do it in the world is to buy a house in London that is only worth 10 million, but you buy it for 20 million. You might think that's a really bad deal, but what you've managed to do is launder 50% of your money. It's suddenly become clean. And on top of that, you know that the Russian state won't be able to nick it off you if you fall out of favor with the regime. So unfortunately, on top of that, we have a lot of legal firms, accountancy firms who are only too happy to facilitate all of that in the UK. And that combination makes us a very soft target for dirty Russian money.
Have we not tightened up at all since, for instance, the attack on the Skripals?
There have been some efforts, and I'm really glad that the government, and I think that this was largely the work of Dominic Raab, has introduced the Magnitsky sanctions, which mean that we can target individuals who were involved in Sergei Magnitsky's death and introduce sanctions against them. And that's excellent. But the unexplained wealth orders hardly seem to work. I think we need to revise them so that they are far more effective. We still have a steady flow of dodgy money into the UK, and we still have a very uncertain means of dealing with it.
What about the sort of wider international community dealing with Russia? We've got a new president in the White House now, Joe Biden. Well, not so new, but had his first meeting with Putin. Do you think that makes a difference to the way the world is going to deal with Russia now?
It undoubtedly makes a difference that Biden is there. I mean, I thought all the way through the G7 summit, oh, thank God Biden won. Thank God. Can you imagine if it had been Trump there? I mean, it would have just been a complete disaster on so many different fronts, whether you're talking about, climate change or international cooperation against illegal money laundering and people trafficking and all the rest of it. My anxiety, however, is that I remember a Spanish prime minister telling me that the only reason that the EU had maintained sanctions against Russia over the annexation of Crimea was because Theresa May came to the meeting and put her foot down very effectively. And my fear is that other countries in Europe will now want to peel off from this position and will just want to do their own private little deal with Russia. And that will undoubtedly undermine the British position, and it may leave us feeling very exposed. This is why I've been saying for some time that whatever you think of Brexit, we still have to find a shared system of some kind of common foreign and defence policy with our European Union allies.
I mean, there's talk just this week, I think, of France and Germany having a meeting with Putin kind of separately, setting up a sort of alternative meeting of some kind. Do you think that the West is fracturing already in terms of how to deal with Russia?
Look, it used to be fractured because Berlusconi in Italy was always wanting to go after bunga bunga parties in Russia. So there's always that danger. The relationship between Cyprus and Greece and Russia sometimes is, I would argue, too close for comfort. But that was the advantage of us sitting around the table. And I think we need to find a new mechanism for a shared European, it doesn't have to be European Union, but a shared European policy position on Russia and, for that matter, other issues in the region.
The trouble is you can have all the mechanisms you like. If the will at the top isn't there, for instance, in Germany, where they seem to be more ready to soft pedal with Russia, then you're always going to have that sort of breach, aren't you?
I think the situation in Germany pulls in two directions at the same time. On the one hand, they are far closer, of course, to allies in Lithuania and Estonia than we are, and they are very conscious of the real fears that there are in Lithuania, for instance, around Russian troops massing on the border, and that brings back terrible memories of events in the 20th century. So I think many Germans are fully aware of that. At the same time, Germany is vulnerable to because it has such a dependency on Russian gas, unlike the UK. One would hope that as all of the countries of Europe adopt a more a carbon neutral attitude, that Russian gas will not be so essential to the geopolitics of the future.
What about the way that Russia can sort of, from the outside, it looks as if Russia can sort of turn on the tap militarily in various places. I mean, I think they managed to assert themselves in Syria. They've obviously got, they've taken land in Ukraine, and that's de facto the sort of frozen conflict whereby they're now in control. It looks as if they're the ones who are always able to kind of up the ante, and we're reacting. Is that fair, or do you think maybe their strength can be sort of exaggerated by the fact that they could apparently have military deployments quite in strength around the world?
Look, the thing about an autocratic, authoritarian regime is that it's much easier to change your mind and surprise everybody on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon. You can make your own decisions, and you're not really accountable to anybody. And there's a tendency in Russian culture to kind of like that kind of big leader, whereas in the UK we've tended to shy away from that kind of form of demagoguery, really. And of course, that brings real challenges to democracies like the UK, where we can't just suddenly change our position without, being accountable to Parliament and through the whole democratic process. So that's something we have to learn to be more adept about and more agile as a country. Our greatest strength has always been, as the UK, that we are not just a bridge but a bond between the United States of America and Europe, and that's the bit that we mustn't lose.
I mean, we've conducted this conversation very much from the point of view that this is Russian expansionism and this is them adventurism. Even just to be devil's advocate, I mean, they will make the case and do make the case that they are responding to encirclement, to NATO coming up to their frontiers, to having to ensure that their own interests are protected. Do you think that's all bogus?
The Russian military doctrine starts with a sentence about how the biggest threat to Russian security is the existence of NATO. This is clearly nonsense. And there's an element of paranoia. They think that any criticism of Russian policy is automatically Russophobic. Actually, most of us who are interested in Russian affairs love Russia and love the Russian people. The bits that we don't like is the excessive use of violence, which I think you can see in Putin's case through from the way he's dealt with Chechnya, the incursion into Georgia, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the way he dealt with the Beslan siege, and for that matter, the Moscow theatre siege. It's always the same pattern, I think, with President Putin himself. And one of his favorite tricks is, if you want to destabilize another country politically, the best way to do it isn't by using expensive military hardware. It's by using 20 kids sitting in a darkened room in St. Petersburg, sending out using social media. So if you look at Spain, for instance, Spain has been systematically attacked by Russian bots trying to promote the idea of independence in Catalonia. Lots of the material that we all thought in the UK was absolutely clear and obvious was actually untrue and deliberate misinformation campaign stimulated from Russia. In Greece, in Macedonia, in so many other countries, in the Balkans, the cheap Russians version of doing politics today is semi-warfare.
Well, this is interesting. They use the phrase semi-warfare. I think the recent Strategic Defence Review talks about Russia as an active threat. Would you go along with that?
Absolutely, it's an active threat, and this is why I'm utterly mystified why the government here, which has repeatedly said that they have seen instances of Russian attempts to undermine British democracy in our elections and in our referendums, has refused to investigate that properly. That's what the Intelligence and Security Committee report found, that there was evidence there, and made a series of recommendations, none of which has been acted upon by the government. And I just think that this is a dereliction of duty. And it does make you wonder, what is it about the Conservative government and its relationship with Russia that makes them want to sort of close their eyes and put their fingers in their ears about Russian interference in British democracy?
I guess you could argue that the government also has a responsibility to have a relationship with Russia, or do you think we just have to treat them as an enemy?
I think you sup with the devil with a very long spoon. That's all. You just have to go into things with your eyes wide open, and it just feels as if the government is determined to not bother with that. What I think actually happened in 2010 was David Cameron came into power, thought that the Labour government under Gordon Brown and to some degree under Tony Blair had managed to mismanage the relationship with the Russians, and that all we should really be interested in was doing more trade with Russia, and then it didn't take long for him to realize that just as when Obama tried to press the reset button with Russia, it didn't really deliver anything for US policy. So it was exactly the same for the UK, because most British businesses can't do much business in Russia because of the corruption. Most British cultural institutions that want to do more work with Russia find it difficult for exactly the same reason.
How damaging do you think it was when under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour, especially on the instance with the Skripal's attack, took a different view to Theresa May in power? Do you think that was a serious problem, a serious mistake?
I think on the hard left in British politics, there has always been a sort. I'd like to think of it as a charming naivety about Russia, whether it was communist Russia or modern day Russia. And in many ways, Putin combines the worst of communism with the worst of capitalism, and that's to turn a country into a kleptocracy, where the theoretically democratically elected people at the top steal from the nation and enrich themselves. But George Lansbury 100 years ago was utterly naive about Russia, and I think Jeremy Corbyn was also naive. It's like he'd said to himself, "My enemy's enemy is my friend." In other words, because he hates America and all it stands for, and perhaps that was understandable under Trump. But because he hates America, therefore he had to love Russia. And it just seemed extraordinary moment. And I think it undoubtedly did us harm in the general election.
Do you think then, what sort of relationship is it possible to have with Russia now? I mean, because I'm intrigued by the fact that there seems to be, with China, there's clearly a sort of perception that this is a big threat growing, but nevertheless we have to kind of get on with them and work with them in some ways. Is it different with Russia? Is it just that we just actually the areas where we can get on with them are limited and not that useful to Britain, and we can treat them more as just a threat?
Well, I think we have to be, first of all, we have to do due diligence in our own country, both about our democratic systems, about cyber, potential cyber attacks, and about our own security. So, Russian subs frequently straying into British waters and airplanes flying over British airspace and so on. Secondly, we need to be utterly consistent all the time in our relationship with Russia. You can't blow hot and cold. That just doesn't work. Thirdly, you do have to be strong and not be intimidated, because I don't think Putin respects anybody who, wilts at the first sign of danger. Fourthly, I think you have to build relationships with other countries so that you are building an alliance around Russia. I would always stick with as much cultural interaction as is possible so that we have more and more understanding of each other. And cordial but robust is how I would characterize what our relationship has to be. And that's what I've always been with the Russian ambassador, even though the last Russian ambassador used to lie through his teeth day in, day out.
Do you think Russia can change under Putin, or we've got to wait for that to happen?
The biggest problem for Russia is that Putin will be so frightened of what might happen to him personally if he is no longer in power, that he will probably seek to remain in power forever and ever. And that's problematic for a country, because that's when the patterns of corruption never get tackled, and the real economic problems that the country has, with a flight of intelligence and of capital and of brain power, gets worse.
So sum it up for me. Do you feel optimistic or gloomy looking ahead to the next couple of years, 3, 4, 5 years, in terms of Britain and Russia?
I am a determined optimist. But I find it quite difficult to see how this relationship is going to get beyond bumping along on the bottom of the gravel pit.
Do you think it could actually turn from cold to hot? Do you think we could actually end up with a situation of some sort of military confrontation where British military are actually facing and in conflict with Russian military? I
think we're already in conflict. It's just that it's this kind of semi-warfare via cyber and other means. No, I don't think that there will be people shooting artillery at one another. But there's a version of semi-warfare going on already.
Are we winning it?
I'm not sure that the British government has yet shown that it's aware that the war is going on.
They claim that, we have the review. They say Russia's an active threat. Do you not think they're at least aware that it's happening?
Well, why haven't they investigated everything that was in the ISC report?
You mean about votes in elections in this country?
Yeah.
So what are you implying, if I can put it that way?
Why have we got to sue the government? A group of us is suing the government to try and make them do what we believe is in the interest of national security.
And you think they're not investigating because?
I think they're not investigating because some of them are ardent Brexiteers and they know that Putin wanted Britain to leave the European Union, and that's part of the way that he stirred the British pot. Whether it made a decisive intervention is a completely different matter. I don't suppose it did, but it certainly attempted to make an intervention, and it may have had some success. Whether some people in government are too closely allied with Russian money, it's difficult to tell. But I think some of that might come out in time.
Chris Bryant, Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Russia, thanks very much for talking to us.
Chris Bryant, Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Russia. Downing Street says there's no need for a new inquiry into Russian interference in British votes, and a High Court ruling has turned down a request for a judicial review on that decision. If you have any thoughts on this or ideas for other podcasts, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.